it's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Leah Szumita, Director of Clinical Trial Support Center at LLS. We're excited to hear from Leah, and we are confident that you'll gain valuable insights from her presentation. Thank you, Leah. Over to you.
Thanks, Belinda. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the warm introduction, Belinda. I'm so happy to be here today and really honored to be able to tell you about another incredible service that we have at the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, and I hope that we can offer some support to you. So the mission of the Leukemia Lymphoma Society is to cure leukemia, lymphoma, Hodgkin's disease, and myeloma, and really to improve the quality of life of all patients and families. And we're doing that in three pillars, if you will. So first, we're funding research to help advance treatments. Secondly, we're advocating for policy and other protections that help patients access care that they need. And third, we're providing one-on-one support to patients and their families. And today I'll be talking to you about one of those one-on-one support programs, the Clinical Trial Support Center. So let's spend just a few minutes first talking about what clinical trials are. So a clinical trial is a carefully controlled research study conducted by doctors to improve the care and treatment of people with cancer or other illnesses. Clinical trials really are the key step in advancing cancer treatment, but unfortunately, enrollment rates are very low. Only about 5 to 8% of adults enroll into a cancer clinical trial in the United States. That number is slightly higher for children. It's somewhere around 20%. But there are so many reasons why these numbers are low. And that is part of what we're doing here is try to really increase awareness and access. But only about 27% of cancer patients are actually eligible for clinical trials right now. So that's a problem. Additionally, 20% of cancer clinical trials end up closing not because the treatment didn't work or because they were unsafe. They close simply because they never had enough patients enroll. So we have a serious problem here. The clinical trial landscape is very complicated. It's extremely overwhelming. And I like to tell people that wanting to enroll into a clinical trial and actually enrolling is not a straight path. There are many, many bumps in the road. And I'll give you some more information about what those bumps are. So first, let's talk about what happens before a clinical trial even becomes a clinical trial. Initial development of a new drug begins in a lab long before it's ever tested in humans. New drug discoveries are made in a lab, not in human beings. This may be a new treatment, or it could be putting together treatments that were previously approved but had not been together at one time. But the key thing to think about is that thousands of experiments or clinical research never actually make it past this first step. But when a researcher feels that they have a promising study or treatment, they can submit an application to the FDA. This is called a new drug application or NDA here. If it's approved, then that treatment can then be studied carefully in clinical trials in human beings. But what I want you to keep in mind is that this looks very simple here, a three-step process. It takes years and years to even even start a clinical trial. And then once you get into the clinical trial, it takes many more years. So we're talking about a very long process. It can take up to decades for treatments to be approved. Rarely, sometimes treatments are fast-tracked and kind of move through those processes more quickly. But I'll tell you, unless a clinical trial has a large number of participants, the process can become very, very slow. So let's take a closer look here. So I think this is a good image to show the different phases of a clinical trial. So I just spent a couple minutes telling you what happens before phase one. This is where those researchers are in the lab and they're testing either a new drug or a combination of drugs together. And in the lab setting, if it's deemed to be safe and hopeful and goes through that approval process, it becomes a phase one clinical trial. Phase one trials are generally a very small number of patients. And what researchers are doing here is giving this new treatment in increasingly larger doses to patients to figure out what is the highest dose with the least amount of side effects. In this phase 1 trial, the same person isn't getting increasingly larger doses. They'll start with just a small number of patients who get 1 dose. If it's safe with manageable side effects, it will move to another group of patients with a higher dose. So that's the goal of a phase 1 clinical trial. Once it moves into a phase 2, the assumption here is that researchers have found a dose that is safe and tolerable. But now the question is, does it really work the way they had hoped? And so a phase 2 clinical trial may have lots of different outcomes that researchers are looking for. It could be complete response. It could be improvement of symptoms. It could be improved quality of life. They're all written very differently. But again, the key here is we have this safe dose with manageable side effects, but does it really work the way we wanted to? So again, when I mentioned to you that thousands of treatments never actually make it through this process, they can drop out at any one of these phases. But after many years, if a phase 2 is successful, it could move into a phase 3. This is the kind of clinical trial where there are two groups of patients. One group of patients gets whatever is being tested, this new treatment. The other group of patients is getting whatever is considered the gold standard or the approved therapy. And what researchers want to know is, does our new treatment work as well or better than what we consider to be the gold standard? And so that is the intent of a phase 3 trial. You may have heard the term randomization before. What that means is in a phase 3 trial, patients are assigned either that control group or the research group. And sometimes you know which group you're in, sometimes you don't. But that's the process of randomization. Phase 4 clinical trials are more rare. This would be a clinical trial that is ongoing after a treatment has received FDA approval. And sometimes those trials can go on for many years to help identify any long-term outcomes. So like any treatment, clinical trials or standard of care, they each have their own benefits and risks. So when we're thinking about a clinical trial, some of the benefits are that those who enroll are really contributing to the present and the future state of their disease. A clinical trial affords someone access to new therapies that the rest of the world might have to wait many years to be able to access. And a great example of this is CAR T therapy. For many years, the only way to access this novel gene therapy was through a clinical trial. And there were so many patients who wanted it, and there were more patients than there were spots available. But now we have some of those approved, that they're now approved. But the point is that oftentimes in a clinical trial, you're receiving a really novel therapy. We'll talk a little bit more about this next one in a few minutes. But the drug or drugs in a clinical trial being studied are generally free, which is a benefit. Another benefit is that by participating in a clinical trial, you have access to physicians with extensive expertise in this type of cancer. Another benefit is the close monitoring and follow-up associated with a clinical trial. But I will tell you, for some, those frequent visits may be something that is a con on their pro and cons list. In terms of risks, so like any other treatment, whether it's an approved therapy or something you might get at over-the-counter at CVS, there is the possibility that treatment in a clinical trial may not work. There's also the risk of unknown side effects. Some people talk about randomization, which I just mentioned, was when you may be assigned in that phase 3 clinical trial to either the control group or the clinical trial group. That randomization is considered a risk to some people. They want to go into that clinical trial guaranteeing they're getting this new treatment, and sometimes they may not. Another risk of clinical trial participation is that likely participation in a trial is going to take you away from home frequently or for an extended period of time. We can talk a little bit more about that. I like to share this image here. This was a survey taken back in 2019 to really get at why people were enrolling in clinical trials. And I think this is really enlightening. The majority of respondents wanted to help advance the science of their disease for themselves and for others. to obtain better treatment for their disease. So you can see how some of those different options rank. But really, again, I can't stress enough that clinical trials really are the key step in advancing cancer treatment. Now, unfortunately, there are many myths associated with clinical trials, and maybe some of you listening today have heard some of them. So hopefully I can help debunk them. A very common myth is that if my provider is mentioning clinical trials, there must be no more hope. I must have exhausted all of my other treatment options. And I want to assure you that is not true. There are clinical trials for every stage of disease, whether someone is newly diagnosed and has not yet received treatment, whether they have received treatment and it did not work or their disease came back. There are even clinical trials for people who are on maintenance therapy and into remission. So clinical trials really are accessible to every patient. What we are striving for at LLS is to spread the word that clinical trials should be discussed at the time of diagnosis and at every change in disease, because talking more about clinical trials will help destigmatize it. The second myth is that clinical trials are not safe and I will not benefit from them. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that there are historical events which have created or led to mistrust in clinical trials. But I can tell you today that patient safety is the top priority in clinical trials in the United States. Clinical trials are closely regulated by the FDA. They're also closely regulated by the institution at which the clinical trial is happening as well. So patient safety is paramount. And the other thing to think about is that at any point in a clinical trial, you can decide that you don't want to continue with treatment as well. So there are lots of patient rights involved with clinical trials as well. The third myth is that someone may get a placebo or a sugar pill in a clinical trial. I can assure you that in a cancer clinical trial, a patient would never only receive a placebo. That would be completely unethical. If a placebo is used in the clinical trial that you are going to be enrolling into, you will know that at the time of consent. If a placebo is involved in a clinical trial, it will always be given with at least the best available therapy. So no patient would ever only receive a placebo or a sugar pill in a cancer clinical trial. So now let's spend just a couple minutes on this one. So I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits is that of a clinical trial is that the drug or the combination of drugs being studied is generally free. The cost of that is covered by the sponsor of the trial. The challenge is all of that other healthcare that someone receives while in a clinical trial must be billed to insurance. So for people who have bad insurance or no insurance, participating in a clinical trial can be very challenging because the out-of-pocket costs associated with covering that other healthcare can be astronomical. Aside from that, there are other costs associated with participating in a clinical trial. As I mentioned, a lot of times you're going to be traveling away from home for either an extended period of time or frequently. So think about those associated costs of food, lodging, travel, etc. So those all add up. I will say that sometimes there is some funding or support for some of those logistical costs associated with the clinical trial, and I'll tell you more about how we can help you figure that out. So, again, wanting to enroll in a trial and actually enrolling is a really bumpy road. As I said, 5 to 8, maybe 8 to 10% of cancer patients actually enroll in a cancer clinical trial in the US. Those rates are even lower for some populations, including people of color, younger patients, older patients, and patients living in rural areas. These barriers exist in both the patient realm and the provider realm. So if we take a minute to look at some patient-specific barriers, health insurance, as I mentioned, huge. There are a very limited amount of places in the United States where you can participate in a clinical trial without health insurance. And again, you have to keep in mind all of those other financial constraints. The other reality is that the majority of Americans do not live where the research is happening. Most academic cancer centers are not where the majority of Americans live, which again requires either extended or frequent travel. There is a fear of participation. Some of that goes back to other historical issues that I referenced. But again, people also just may have a fear of the unknown. Another huge problem is that there is a lack of awareness of clinical trials in general and whether or not someone may be eligible for a clinical trial. It's also really difficult to figure out if you're eligible for one. So you can see here the eligibility criteria are very complex and difficult to understand as well. When we take a look at provider-facing barriers, there are several. Unfortunately, busy providers don't have the time or resources to be able to do the deep dive into the clinical trials to figure out what their patients may be eligible for, particularly if there are no clinical trials within their own institution. There is a fear of losing a patient to another center as well, unfortunately. Additionally, there is, a variability in how clinical trials are talked about with patients. What we know through some of the research we've done is that clinical trials aren't being talked about enough, and especially not early enough. But these are nuanced conversations. They're time-intensive conversations that busy practitioners may not be able to do. And there's also ineffective patient identification. So what does that mean? That may mean that the provider may assume that a particular patient would not want to be in a clinical trial, therefore they don't mention it as a potential option. Or they may think that someone may be eligible, but not even know like what the next step is. So you can see here, all of these things really contribute to making it very difficult to enroll into a clinical trial. So if you are confused, overwhelmed, I want you to know that we're here to help you. The Clinical Trial Support Center is a department that was developed almost 8 years ago. And so to give you a little bit of history, back in around 2016, 17, more and more patients started to call our 1-800 number at LLS, which is our Information Resource Center. You learned about that in a prior series. This is an amazing resource that is staffed by master's prepared social workers. And so more and more patients and families were calling, wanting to learn about clinical trials. And because it is such an overwhelming process, it was very clear to LLS that there needed to be a designated resource for this. So this department that I'll refer to as the CTSC started as one part-time nurse. If you fast forward to today, we are now a team of 12 nurse navigators with expertise in both pediatric and adult blood cancer. And although we've grown exponentially and we've definitely become more efficient in how we do our work, the mission stays the same. And it's to help patients or families identify potential clinical trials and then overcome the barriers to enrollment. If you've ever done a Google search or an internet search of clinical trials, you might see that there are lots of clinical trial search tools out there. I will tell you what sets us apart is that every patient, family, or their healthcare provider who reaches out to us is going to work one-on-one with a designated nurse navigator throughout the duration of that relationship. So that may just be a few weeks, but more likely it's many months, if not years. And so that unique relationship really helps patients and their families access the care that they need. I'll go a little bit more in depth about how we do that, but what I want to show you here before I get into that is just how complicated, if you didn't already feel this way, it is to find a clinical trial that you might be eligible for. So if you look at this filter here and you look at all the pills at the top of this, this filter, think about this as all of the clinical trials available for a certain diagnosis. When you start to factor in all of the unique characteristics of a patient, so their age, their prior medical history, their diagnosis, their markers, their mutations, prior treatments, what their treatment goals are, et cetera, at the end of that, there are only a few that someone may be eligible for. And so sometimes it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And so that is what our group of nurse navigators are able to do. They're able to navigate that process and identify potential options. Let me go back a little bit to how we operate. So no matter how someone finds us, again, they're going to work with a designated nurse navigator. And so right at the onset of that relationship, there's a comprehensive assessment of all those factors you just saw on the prior screen. So what is someone's diagnosis and treatment history? There are genetic markers and mutations, other comorbidities. What is their understanding of their available treatment options? And there's always some amount of education we can offer at that point, whether it's about clinical trials or standard of care. But we also need to get a good understanding of what someone's goals of treatment are. What are their preferences of treatment? What is their quality of life? What do they want to be able to continue to do? There's also a psychosocial assessment to understand what types of resources someone has that may make participating in a clinical trial feasible, or what is happening in their life that may make participating in a clinical trial difficult. And so it's taking all of those unique patient characteristics into account and doing that deep dive into the clinical trials to figure out what is that needle in the haystack? What are the potential trials that someone may be eligible for? And we have had the privilege of building a database that helps us with that. But I'll tell you, it requires a lot of manual curation. The nurse navigator, all of them on my team, are just true experts in blood cancer, and they can take all of that information, read through the complex eligibility criterion to really figure out what is a potential option. What we don't do is give patients and their families a 20-page list of clinical trials. That's incredibly overwhelming for both the family and whomever they're going to take that list with, too. But we want to give a pared down list of potential options. And we tell people, take this information that we're giving you back to your healthcare team or take it to your second opinion, get their expertise. And then once you know what the next best step is, that nurse navigator is there in your court. She's there to help with the outreach, to learn more about eligibility, or to reach out to see if there are resources to support travel for you and the caregiver, to see what type of process there is for a new patient appointment at the site, to figure out if your insurance is accepted, whatever that might be. There's lots of outreach that's done behind the scenes. And the beautiful part is that patients or families can call or email that nurse navigator anytime with any questions that come up throughout the entire process, even beyond as they enroll and go through treatment. So it's really that personal connection that is the secret to our success in helping patients access the care they need. This is a very busy slide. I just want to show you here that when we are working to pull together a list of potential treatment options for patients, no two lists are ever the same. We are going to tailor the information we provide to best fit the needs of the patient that we're working with. So for some patients, they want to know what's the latest data. What was just at ASH in December? Tell us all the latest and greatest, and we can include that in there. For other patients, maybe less is more. And maybe they'd be better suited, listening to a podcast about their diagnosis rather than reading through data about a clinical trial. But it's a really rich document that is a wealth of resources, both about the clinical trials that we're suggesting as potential options, but also additional educational support resources as well. And if you can see in this small print here, I just want to call out like some of this highlighting here. This is all personal to that specific patient that we had in mind, talking about all the outreach that the nurse has done. What has she heard back from the sites or the sponsors? What is she still waiting to hear back from? So the goal of the CTSC is not to enroll every patient into a clinical trial, but really to increase the opportunities for participation by facilitating informed decision-making and minimizing logistical barriers. I want to emphasize that we work in collaboration with the patient's healthcare team to decide if a clinical trial is right for them. We are not looking to take a patient away from their care team. Ultimately, it's about educating, supporting, and empowering patients to be active participants in and have control over their treatment decisions. So this is a busy slide. I just want to show you again how we really want to be an extension of your healthcare team. You can see on the slide, there are lots of different ways that we're working with providers. We have been the primary trial navigation service for the American Society of Hematology. We work closely with the VA health system to help their patients identify and access clinical trials. We're doing lots of work with pediatric oncologists to help patients access the care they need as well. So we want to work in conjunction with the team. And sometimes that means simply just offsetting the workload that it takes to come up with a list of these trial options for the doc and giving it back to them so that they can have that shared decision-making conversation with the patient to access the care that they need. So you don't have to just take my word for it. I do have some data to support our work. Here, I just want to show you a glimpse of our team. So as I mentioned, we are a team of both pediatric and adult blood cancer nurses. I have 3 pediatric nurse practitioners. I have an adult nurse practitioner. I have other advanced practice nurses. I have nurses who have been working in clinical trials for many years in transplant, cellular therapy. We have a remarkable amount of expertise amongst the team and really are armed to meet the needs of any patient or family that comes to us. We're also spread across the United States in most time zones, and we have Spanish-speaking nurse navigators as well. So when we look back at our last fiscal year, at that time we were a team of 12 nurses, and we assisted just over 1,100 patients. On behalf of those patients, the nurse navigators completed about 10,400 interactions. So again, those are phone calls and emails to learn more about eligibility, et cetera. 20% of eligible patients enrolled into a clinical trial. So think back to the beginning of this lecture. You know, clinical trial enrollment is somewhere between 5 and 8%. Some of the literature suggests it might be slightly higher. So we are well above that benchmark, which is great. But I look at that as so much more room to grow and help more and more patients. The number that I love to share with people, though, is that for us to have helped a patient enroll into a clinical trial, it took, on average, 22 interactions by one of the CTSC nurse navigators on behalf of a patient to achieve enrollment. So again, those are phone calls and emails to learn more about eligibility, insurance, try to find financial resources for support. Those, without question, are 22 cracks in a road that most patients would probably fall through if they had to navigate this process on their own. You can see here on the pie graph here, pie chart, that the majority of our patients last year who entered a clinical trial had a diagnosis of leukemia. You can see the other breakdowns. But the reasons that patients did not enroll, these are very consistent with what you'll see in the literature for cancer clinical trial barriers. A proportion of patients were not indicated for a treatment change. A proportion of patients had their team recommend something other than a clinical trial. And then there were patients who had insurance constraints, no trial within preferred geography, and then additional financial constraints beyond insurance. Just quickly here, I want to show you that about 45% of the patients that we helped were in a relapsed refractory state. So that means that their treatment either stopped working or their disease came, or it didn't work and their disease came back. But you can see we're helping people across that spectrum of disease, from newly diagnosed into maintenance, remission, and survivorship. Over the past couple of years, we started to collect some really novel data. And this is at that first initial conversation between a patient or their family and their nurse navigator to identify what are the potential barriers right out of the gate that someone may have to participating in a clinical trial. And so here are the top 6. Someone may not be clinically indicated for a treatment change at that time. And that is common. Many patients come to us wanting to have a plan B in the event that plan A stops working. Patients with insurance constraints, again, their team may be recommending something other than a trial, but they want to know what all of their options are. A proportion of patients had no known barriers, but again, financial constraints are high. And then specific option limiting preferences as well were potential barriers to enrollment. And so that could be, patients who specifically don't want traditional chemotherapy as an example of something that may limit options. Just a little more data. We recently finished a formal evaluation of our department. And this was a survey of patients between February 2023 and February 2024. We had about a 28.3% response rate. And what I really want to highlight is that, patients were very satisfied with what they were doing, the work they were doing with their nurse navigator. So you can see here, the majority of patients were very comfortable in their conversations with the nurse. They felt like their conversations were clear. They felt like the nurse navigator was helpful, that they were able to answer the patient's questions, that they were treated with courtesy and respect, and they felt like the nurse navigator spent enough time with them as well. And I think that's really important. So I will just move onto this slide here. This was a patient who had worked with us over the past few years, and I think this is a really compelling quote. I've been in contact with social workers and clinical trial navigators at LLS and can hardly believe how accessible, knowledgeable, helpful, and genuinely caring they have been. The expertise at LLS has saved me hours of research and countless sleepless nights, and that's exactly why we're doing this work. So if you have questions about whether or not you might be eligible for a clinical trial or you just want to learn more about them, I encourage you to reach out. You can reach out in several different ways. You could call our Information Resource Center here. Again, that is the team of remarkable master's prepared social workers who are ready to answer any question you might have. You can complete our online referral form here, or you can just email me directly at ctsc@lls.org, and I will do my very best to help you get the information and access the care that you need. And then this is just a little bit about our Information Resource Center again. I would encourage you, if anybody's interested in learning more about a diagnosis, a treatment, having any challenges, either psychosocially, emotionally, or financially, please, I encourage you to reach out to the Information Resource Center. My group works very closely with this group to make sure that we are getting patients all of the resources that they need. And
Okay, Leah, thank
handing
you.
it back to you, Belinda.
Yes, thank you so much, Leah. Now we'll take some time to read and answer some of your questions. So let me check here. Okay, so I do have a question that can a patient caregiver reach out directly to the trial personnel, or does my medical team need to do this?
So if you're interested in a specific clinical trial, you can reach out directly. But what will happen inevitably in the process is that there will need to be a connection between your provider and the research team. So whether that happens right from the onset, or you start that conversation first, that's up to you. It can be very tricky sometimes to figure out who to call to access a clinical trial. So if it's something that I could help you with, I would encourage you to reach out, and I can help you find that right number, and also help you share information back with your doctor. If it's a trial that your doctor is suggesting, that's helpful. But if it's not, again, I can, one of the things that we're doing during our education is really helping patients start that conversation with their doctor. Because a lot of times clinical trials aren't discussed as a treatment option, and patients are the ones starting that conversation. We can help guide that conversation for you and give you some talking points as well.
Let me check. Okay, I've heard about basket trials. What does that mean?
Good question. So basket trials mean that within the trial itself, there are lots of different treatment options. I don't have the most articulate example response for that question, but we do have two basket trials at LLS. One is focused on adult acute myeloid leukemia, and one is focused on pediatric leukemia. And so within that, there are many different treatments that patients could be assigned to.
Okay, and this is a question that was emailed, and they're asking, I've heard in a trial that you sometimes don't know if you're getting the treatment or something else. Is this always the case?
So that's called being blinded in the study. That would be in the phase 3 trial where you are receiving either the treatment being studied in the clinical trial or the best approved therapy. It depends on how the clinical trial is written. If it's blinded, that means patients don't know which treatment they're getting. That also would mean that the provider doesn't know what arm or type of treatment the patient's getting either. Unblinded trials mean that you're told right from the beginning what treatment you would be assigned to.
Okay, What happens when a trial is over? Will I continue to have access to the treatment if it is working for me?
Another great question. So that depends again on how the clinical trial is written and the reason for why the trial ended. And so sometimes if the clinical trial completes and then goes towards FDA approval, the sponsors may allow access to the treatment until it becomes FDA approved. But if the trial closed for other reasons, you may not always, even if it's working, you may not always have continued access to that treatment.
Okay. And I believe there is one more. Should I reach out to the trial folks if I don't know if I qualify for the trial or if I know I don't? If I really want to be part of the trial, is it worth talking to them about it?
Knowledge is power. I would always encourage patients to ask questions and to find out more. And I think, the eligibility criteria as they're posted online, so like either like on the hospital that your webpage or through clinicaltrials.gov can be really difficult to understand, even for a healthcare provider. So it makes total sense that you would want to reach out and just verify whether or not you're eligible or not. And there are research coordinators and study staff who can do that screen to see if you're preliminarily eligible. So I would always encourage you to reach out, ask the questions, and find out if you're eligible.
I do have, there's another one. I've heard about the trials that are N of 1. What does that mean?
So N of 1 means there's one patient being one patient in that clinical trial. That is rare, and it is difficult sometimes to be able to access treatment that way, because that would require a site to open a clinical trial, which is time intensive and resource exhaustive for one patient. But we have seen it happen before. And it might be a matter of, a clinical trial is happening at a site, and maybe there's a patient that would be a good potential participant at a different site and isn't able to travel. Maybe that's how an N of 1 trial is started. But again, that's very rare in occurrence.
Okay, and Leah, I think this was the last one. Can you tell me how I can find out about trials if I live outside the US?
Great question. So the Clinical Trial Support Center, LLS, helps patients in both the US and Canada. If you are outside of the US, I would suggest reaching out to advocacy organizations where you're at. There are lots of different advocacy organizations in Europe that may be able to help you navigate clinical trials. Clinicaltrials.gov does have clinical trials outside the US as well, but again, that's a very difficult database to navigate. So I would steer you more towards advocacy organizations to help you navigate that process.
Okay, it looks like we've addressed all the questions. Thank you, Leah, for a great presentation. Go ahead and
Thank you for having me.
yes, absolutely. And thank you all for being here.